Christ, the Lord. Amen. Lord bless you. Lord, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord, if it comes upon you, and give you his peace. Amen. Amen. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
So, Pedro. Ped. All right. So this bread came down. This bread came down. This came down then. But that is enough.
This House is now in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, the 9th of October, 2018.
Good morning. I beg to move that the minutes of the proceedings of this Honourable House of Assembly at its meeting of Tuesday, the 9th of October 2018, which have been circulated, be taken as read.
If there are no observations or corrections, let those minutes stand confirmed.
Announcements by your Honor the Speaker.
No.
Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General.
Okay.
Petitions, papers.
Mr. Speaker, I am commanded to lay...
The Honourable Member for St. Michael South Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am commanded to lay the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan.
Nothing. Government, there's no need for...
It's awesome.
Because some minister, I give. Other members want it. Government notices, private members notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees. Speaker, this. Congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day. No, because that's some problem.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that standing orders numbers 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, 5, 43, and 44 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned orders are suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business. Order number 3. In the name of the Honourable Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment, to move the passing of a resolution to take note of the Green Paper on planning law reform.
Business is now the order of the day. The honourable member for St. Michael South Central.
Do you have a copy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So that's what I'm required to do? Mr. Speaker, whereas the government of Barbados has determined that there should be a modernized strategic approach to physical development planning in Barbados, with a view to making the planning process more transparent and efficient through the development of a green paper on planning law reform. And whereas it is recognized that a modern, fit-for-purpose town planning system and the requisite land use policy are vital cogs in any system established to transform the socio-economic landscape of Barbados. And whereas it is accepted that land use planning is an integral part of the process of national growth and development, and that economic decisions to focus on tourism, the manufacturing industry, agricultural development as the basis for Barbados' economic development must be translated into land use terms. And whereas a strategic approach informs the thrust of the government as it seeks to develop new planning legislation which epitomizes good governance, efficiency, transparency and consistency, and which supports high-quality, sustainable development for current and future generations. And whereas this new approach calls for the orderly and progressive development of lands, taking cognizance of the need for effective regulation of land development, planning obligations, enforcement of decisions, and the right of appeal. And whereas the strategic approach has at its core the improvement in the quality and speed of the delivery of services in Barbados, in particular, town and country planning permissions to promote doing business with ease. And whereas the Green Paper on Planning Law Reform in Barbados has as its 5 goals transparency and accountability, openness and inclusiveness, efficiency and effectiveness, sustainable development, and being fit for purpose. And whereas this Green Paper on Planning Law Reform in Barbados, with its clear articulation of policy direction, prescribes the role of the Minister, the Chief Town Planner, the applicants, the private sector, and the general public in the holistic and all-embracing development of a modernized legislative framework and planning system. And whereas the Cabinet on September 18, 2018 approved the Green Paper on Planning Law Reform in Barbados and agreed that should be laid in Parliament. Be it resolved that Parliament take note of the Green Paper on Planning Law Reform in Barbados. So, Mr. Speaker, with reference to the aforeread resolution, I wish this morning to stand to support and present to this Honourable Chamber the draft Green Paper on Planning Law Reform, which seeks to outline and seeks to engage the people of Barbados in a very needed conversation. And Mr. Speaker, I want to frame this conversation as one that is not so much technical as it is fundamental. I want to frame this conversation as being about a matter that perhaps over the last decade led, or perhaps not led as we were, it is a concept and an idea, and this planning law reform green paper is based on something that perhaps in Barbados we have lost a bit of our grip on over the last decade. It is something that we have had perhaps a tradition of since independence, but something that we have not sufficiently seen. But it is something that is fundamental, and it is the simple matter, Mr. Speaker, of growth. And when I talk about growth, I'm talking about growth of a particular kind. I'm talking about a growth that is led by transformation, a growth that is inclusive and led by people. And, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons that I'm pleased that we have this morning as a House taken note of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan is that these words, economic recovery and transformation, are important. They're not by accident. The plan is so named because of the way that this Barbados Labour Party government has had to frame our work on behalf of the people of Barbados who gave us the overwhelming mandate and placed in us the overwhelming trust that they did on May 24th. The plan, sir, speaks to economic recovery, but, sir, beyond that, it speaks to transformation. And I want us to understand that in coming to government and in coming to leadership, this Barbados Labour Party government had to identify some mission-critical activities in which to engage. We had to seek, sir, before we could do any further surgery on the patient, we had to stop the bleeding and stabilize the patient. And so we had to stop the hemorrhaging of foreign reserves. We had and continue to have to address the debt issue. We have had to address some of the critical economic challenges that this country has been left to deal with. And so we've had to give some attention in the phase 1 of the BERT plan to the kinds of measures that will mean that this country of ours that we love can have a possibility of a future. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, the BERT plan also speaks to transformation. And I dare say that anyone that were to read the Barbados Labour Party manifesto would see that while we do discuss in detail the mission-critical interventions that were needed, the large part of the document speaks to transformation. It speaks to what are the things that will drive growth, what are the sectors in which we expect growth to be driven, what are the kinds and levels of investment that are required to drive this growth. And really, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to a re-engineering, a reimagining of Barbados. And so while the BERT plan is a reasonably short document, because we came to government having, sir, to immediately address issues that were left at the feet of the people of Barbados. And so we had very quickly to act, something that the last administration has only a passing acquaintance with doing. We had to act. But But it does not mean, sir, that we had not and do not continue to spend the time before the last general election and since thinking and consulting and coming up, sir, with the ways in which we can engage and must engage all Barbadians in the future development of this country. And so, beyond the recovery issues that we have spoken to so much in this honourable chamber over the last few weeks, the BERT also speaks to very important growth issues. It speaks to the ways in which we will lay the foundation for making sure that we have sustainable growth in this country. And I have to say sustainable, sir, because, you know, I want us to understand that the one-off sale of assets, as proposed on so many occasions under the last administration, is not growth. It may be a short stop or a band-aid for shoring up the reserves. But, sir, indeed, almost every measure, if it could be so called, that was suggested by the last administration was really not about addressing any structural issues that this country has to grapple with. But, sir, the BERT plan, against which backdrop we are discussing this draft green paper on planning law reform, does begin to outline those strategies. And I want to say that this 27-page document is not meant to contain the meaning of life, Mr. Speaker, sir. It is not meant to contain and to detail every single strategy in which this government will engage and will seek to engage the people of Barbados. For that, we have other instruments. For that, we will develop other more detailed plans. But it does give the framework for the growth reforms that we anticipate. So one of the critical factors, sir, in the unsustainable debt problem that this country had thrust upon it by the last administration, was that for a decade there was really no growth in this country. And in fact, in the 6 months up to June 2018, the first part of this year, the economy contracted a further 0.6%. And that put it, sir, at levels that were barely above where we reached in 2007. So we have an economy, sir, that is essentially the same size as it was over a decade ago. Nothing was happening. And so we as a government are placing and have started to place very early emphasis on economic recovery, yes, but also on the shift to a higher growth rate in this country. And so in the BERT plan, the growth strategy rests on 5 pillars. The first is investing in and deepening existing investments in skills training and in education. A second is better mobilizing private domestic savings for local investment. A third is making government an enabler of growth. And this third and perhaps fourth pillars are what bring us to this conversation today. Making government an enabler of growth. A fourth is supporting the mainstays of the current economy as being tourism and international business. And a fifth pillar is promoting a new, high-skilled, knowledge-based, technology-empowered, diversified economy, one that encompasses renewable energy, creative and artistic industries, education and health services, high-tech agro-industries, and research. So, sir, that is the backdrop against which I wish to discuss this draft green paper. Because this is not a technical exercise to make amendments to existing legislation. It is necessary, sir, because the current Town and Country Planning Act that was enacted in 1965 was based on UK legislation that was devised, like so many things that we currently have operating and that we need to step back from and consider whether they serve us today. But the current act was really devised for a different era, a different time, a different place. And so that nearly 52 years after our independence, sir, it is fitting that we go back to first principles and that we revisit the issue of physical development and planning law and come up with legislation that is relevant to the 21st century in Barbados. And this legislation is relevant, is necessary, is critical, sir, because it is really fundamental to being able to drive the kind of investment that we want to see. It is critical to improving the ease of doing business in this country. And it is the kind of step that will signal to the world that Barbados is open for business again, and beyond being open for business again, that we are serious about stepping into the third decade of the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, in the 2018 Doing Business report, the World Bank ranked Barbados 132nd out of 190 countries with respect to the overall ease of doing business. And this new ranking, sir, meant that we had now slipped 15 places below our previous position. And sir, Barbadians within the sound of my voice will perhaps have gotten used to this notion of having slipped in international estimation of our neighbors. Because, regrettably, this is where we have found ourselves over and over again over the last decade. And you know, one of the things that is perhaps most upsetting to me, has been most upsetting to me, having taken stock of where we have come and how we have come to be here, is the real danger and the real fear that mediocrity take hold in this country. That is the fear. That we may have gotten so used under the last administration to non-performance, to underachievement, to being underwhelming as a country, that somehow it is what we come to expect. But this Barbados Labour Party administration is here, sir, to help, and I say help, because it is not just us in here that can do it. But we are here certainly to help return Barbados to its tradition of excellence. And that is a part of what we are discussing here today. So one of the major factors, sir, that can explain why we have come so far down in the doing business rankings, in the competitiveness index, and other similar international measures, has to do with simply how easy it is to get things done in this country. How long does it take, for example, to deal with a construction permit? Barbados is 155th of 190 countries with respect to dealing with construction permits. It takes an average, this is as of the 2018 report, it takes an average of 442 days, 14 and a half months to be approved. The average time is 192 days for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Sir, I repeat that because it is only when we start to get specific about what is plaguing us that we can address and correct it. With respect to dealing with construction permits, it takes an average of 442 days, 14.5 months in Barbados to be approved. compared to the 6.3-month regional average in Latin America and the Caribbean. And, sir, this average delay exceeds the 2-month limitation period that we had determined for applications for planning permission to be responded to under the current Act. So we are failing ourselves. We are failing our own targets that we have set. And sir, this green paper on planning law reform seeks, among other things, to address these failures. Because it is only by doing so that we will create the growth and investment environment that is needed to take this country forward. And I will not, in this debate today, seek to get into all of the sectors in which we will expect growth to take place. I will not seek to get to specifics of what percentage average for the medium term going forward we would expect to get to. I will not get into these matters today because I want to do justice to this piece of work. I want to take us through not just what is being placed before us for consideration, but also to make reference to the fact that as a green paper, this document has been placed in the public domain. For Barbadians, sir, to interact with the content, for Barbadians to understand what it is we are trying to achieve, and to have a say in how the government of Barbados does its business. So, in response to this fall in the Doing Business Index, the Competitiveness Index, and other international indices, in our 2018 manifesto, this Barbados Labour Party government committed to improving the quality and speed of delivery of services, including town and country planning permissions that will promote doing business with ease in Barbados. And beyond that, in our manifesto, sir, we undertook to modernize our approach to physical development planning by making the development control process transparent and accountable. And how would we do that? By providing, amongst other things, for public comment on development proposals, by providing for public participation in decision-making, and for the publication of decisions and the reasons for approval or refusal of applications. Sir, regrettably again, one of the casualties of the last administration was the public trust. People started to develop the notion that its government was making deals and making decisions to which it was not privy. And that's one of the reasons, sir, that this green paper does not stand alone in the types of actions that we are about to take with respect to transparency and accountability. I have stood in this very place, sir, and spoken to the electronic dashboard that we hope and that we will implement, which is really a way for not just us who work on behalf of the people of Barbados, but a way for the people of Barbados to be able to look and see, not just for public sector investment projects, but also for projects that may have a private component, to see what is their stage of implementation, what may be any bottlenecks that are delaying their progress, and what is some of the basic expenditure information that is associated with the project. And this relates, sir, to projects that the people of Barbados would have a strong interest in, projects that are transformational in nature, projects that stand to really change and improve fundamentally and substantially the well-being and the welfare of the people of this country. So that, sir, we no longer want to have a culture and an environment in which people hear about what government is doing on the streets, in the alleys, in the corners. This Barbados Labour Party government is cultivating a spirit of real democracy, because democracy is not just about going to the polls every 5 years. Democracy is about participation in the decision-making of the government that you have elected. And so this green paper, sir, is just one of the many ways in which we have demonstrated that commitment to transparency and accountability. The integrity bill is another. That too has been and continues to be in the public domain. The discussion about making government fit for purpose and making sure that people have a say in how it wants its government to be shaped and to be constituted to do its business. That has been in the public domain through the online survey to which so many people responded. And so this is not, sir, just a fly-by-night approach, but this is one that will continue to characterize this Barbados Labour Party government. And so, in order to engage the people of this country in the development of this new legislation, the Office of the Prime Minister and the Barbados Town Planning Society in July organized 2 stakeholder consultations on the reform of the planning system. And these were held on the 16th and the 25th of July. And further, they were live streamed for interactive public participation, so that those who were not able to physically be there could also participate and could listen to the views and reflect on what was being discussed. The issues that were raised, sir, in those consultations and the recommendations that came from those consultations have been taken into account in the writing of the paper before us today. And so already we are hearing and we are listening to and we are reflecting back to the people of Barbados their own assessment and understanding of what they want to see. Sir, the question of town planning applications and decisions and physical development planning is one that many Barbadians, most Barbadians I would say, know all too well. And I stopped to make this point because I don't want to give the impression that what we are concerned with here today is simply making it easier for people to come in and invest. We want people to come in and invest. We need to make it easier for them. But we also need to make it easier for Barbadians to invest in their own country. And sir, the kind of growth that is going to sustain us is the kind of growth that is led by Barbadians. And that is why we have said as a government that we are willing to trust people. You know, a former colleague of all of ours once said something that I will never forget. He said, as we were developing the manifesto, and he is in this chamber, I may remember, he said, if we are asking the people of Barbados to trust us, we have to trust the people. That is something that I now find ironic, but I still find worthy of taking forward. And that is why, sir, we developed the trust loans. Because we realize that not everyone is in a position to be able to access highly collateralized loans. Not everyone can go before a bank, especially in the current climate, the climate that was created under the last administration, and have access to the kind of capital that is required, even for just small businesses. Even for a welder who wants to buy new equipment, a hairdresser who wants to buy some new dryers. even for sole proprietor kinds of operations, it is very difficult to access just small amounts of capital. And that's why we said that under the trust loan program, regular Barbadians who have found it difficult to get their businesses going will be eligible for up to $5,000 to be able to invest in their small business. And it is a trust exercise, because we are saying that not that there will not be basic stipulations, but that we want you to know that the government of Barbados is willing to invest in you. And so this green paper, sir, is not just about driving large investment, which we must do, and which, thankfully, you know, the Honourable Prime Minister always has a saying that it's better to be born lucky than to be born rich. And somehow, and I think it may have had something to do with the results of May 24th, and I think it may have had something to do with the fact that people now believe in the leadership of Barbados again, but somehow we are now attracting again the level of investment interest that is going to mean that this kind of legislation reform is important. People still believe in Barbados. People are still willing to invest in Barbados. And so we want them to come, but we also want to create the environment for domestic investors. Because a former Barbados Labour Party or an older Barbados Labour Party used to say, and what drove the Labour Party then was that Barbadians needed to have a piece of the rock. But going forward, what we're also saying is that Barbadians need to have not just a piece of the rock, but a piece of the action. Because wealth is not just about the tangible anymore. And wealth is not cash. And so we have to create and start to foster the entrepreneurial spirit and the spirit of investment and believing in yourself that you can create your own capacity to generate income based on the talent that you have, based on the education that we nurture in this country that is our tradition. But sir, not just foreign investment, not just domestic investment in business, but sir, Barbadians need to feel that not everything that they have to get up and leave home to go and do, and perhaps not even leave home, but not every transaction in which they engage must be a nuisance. We have regrettably, over the last decade, developed an over-bureaucratized reality in this country. And I know what is behind it. Because I know that the longer you delay someone, the longer you frustrate them, the more likely they are to perhaps just go in their pocket and find some persuasion for you to get things moving. Delay is the partner of corruption, sir. And we have seen that played out over the last 10 years. But Barbadians now feel that they don't even want to go and engage with any provider, including in government, and perhaps especially in government. Because there has taken hold over the last decade the sense that government is not here to help you do your business, but government is here to find a way to tell you no. And that cannot be the purpose of government. Government is meant to be a facilitator of business, an enabler of growth, an enabler of people to self-actualize and to find their way to live the kind of life in which they will find value. That is why we are here. And so, a part of the task of this Barbados Labour Party government, along with all the other things that we need to fix and that we are continuing to have to fix. And the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central knows this well, because 80% of his commitment every day is cleaning up messes that have been made in the Ministry of Finance where he sits. And that's not the only place that messes have been made. But we are committed to the fix, sir, because we are committed to this country and to the people of Barbados. And so, town planning decisions and applications have represented perhaps one of the major frustrations for business people, but also for regular people who are trying to do a small repair to their house, or just trying to add some facility to make their children's lives, improve their children's lives in some way. We want not just to encourage investment, but we want to remove nuisances from the lives of people. And that is one of the reasons that we have undertaken this work. And so the governance model that the government of Barbados has established for approaching this reform is really one that we apply with everything that we do, and it is really about first principles. It's really about asking the following questions. What is the public interest that the government must seek to protect? What do we have to protect the public from? We have a responsibility to make sure that all our citizens are treated fairly, and that we do not perpetuate a system in which people are brought to harm. So what is the public interest that the government must seek to protect? What is the public mischief against which the government must guard? How does the use of technology potentially help the government achieve its goals? What are the social justice issues that the government needs to take into account? And what are the structures and the processes that government can put in place to get the views of Barbadians and to include them in decision making? So, what is the public interest that we have to protect? What is it that the public must gain or must stand to gain? What is the public mischief against which we are protecting? What are the social justice issues that we need to bear in mind always? How can we use technology to do what we need to do? And what are the structures and the processes that government must put in place to make sure that people participate, are allowed to participate in effective decision making? So those are the 5 governance questions that we have used in approaching this, and that we will continue to use in advancing a lot of the work that we must do in order to address some of the structural factors that have been inhibiting growth in this country. You know, we have said in our manifesto that the government must be able to move beyond tax and spend powers in carrying out its duty to the people of Barbados. The government has other powers, including regulation, including facilitation, including legislation. And these are the things that are going to be able to address some of the structural issues, some of the things that are now endemic to the way that Barbados as a small island is structured, that are now perhaps entrenched in the way that we operate as a small economy, that have made us believe that we cannot do any different. But we are unpacking, sir, everything that we have taken to be true, everything that we believe about ourselves, and we are going back to basics to create a Barbados that is fit and that the people of Barbados deserve. And so the review process and the proposed changes are measured against and done against the background of a few goals. One is transparency and accountability, so that all decisions in the town planning system should be made in a way that is clear about who or what body has made the decision and why the decision has been made. Because too many of government's decisions have been mired in the notion that somebody knew somebody, or somebody was able to facilitate some particular benefit for somebody. A modern society cannot operate that way. You know, one of the things that we say in economics has to obtain in any public policy system is that public policy and public decisions have to be predictable. This is the only way in which the market will be able to make any decisions. It has to be predictable. People have to have a reasonable sense of the range of outcomes that can come from any particular action or activity. It cannot be completely arbitrary. Or you cannot be told, well, I don't know where this thing is because I don't know who's dealing with it, or I am not sure who made that decision. I am not sure whose signature that is on the file. We cannot operate as a modern Barbados in that way. So decisions in the town planning system must be made in a way that is clear about who or what body has made the decision. Goal 2 has to do with openness and inclusiveness, so that members of the public should be able to input into the decision-making process. Goal 3, that drives our approach to this planning law reform: efficiency and effectiveness. Decisions should be made in a timely manner, and prescribed time scales should be adhered to by all parties. It sounds simplistic to say, but simply, time is money. There's an opportunity cost associated with perhaps every activity. And so, the more you create uncertainty in people's lives, the more difficult their lives become, and the more costly to them. I read a paper some time ago that had as its premise, poverty is expensive. Poverty is expensive because it comes with a high degree of uncertainty. And so when your life is not certain, when you do not know what to expect, when you are made to wait for long periods of time, there is a cost to you. And so one of the things that we are looking to implement here, not just here, but I would say across many of the services of government, is that we have to be able to prescribe by which time should you expect to hear a decision having been made on your matter, and if that time elapses and you have had no response, then what is the penalty? What is the repercussion? Goal 4, sir, speaks to the issue of sustainable development. Decisions should be guided by the principles of sustainable development, ensuring long-term environmental, economic, and community health and well-being. Sir, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just last week produced a report that told us perhaps what we already knew, but they were able to confirm. We know that sea level rise and the attendant environmental issues are real concerns and critical issues for small island developing states like ours. But what that report said to us is that the 1.5 degrees of warming that was agreed under the Paris Agreement, that countries said, okay, we will try and contain it there. Even that means that we will see a further 70 to 90% decline in our coral reefs. Now, our coral reefs are one of the major assets that this country has. And so 1.5 degrees is difficult to do, to achieve. It's doable, but it's difficult. But even then, we are looking at up to 90 degrees, up to 90% degradation. If we get up to 2%, we are looking at 99% degradation in coral reefs. Barbados is so small as to be entirely coastal. We talk about coastal areas, but we are so small that even standing in the middle of the country, you stand to be affected by any severe activity on the coast. And further, from an economic perspective, any degradation to our coastal area affects us all. These issues of climate change and resilience are survival issues for this country and for this economy. And we have to make sure that the principles of sustainable development are foremost in our mind as we go forward. Goal 5, sir, and I take the time to go through these because I want us to understand that this Barbados Labour Party government is purposeful in our approach to all things. And my grandmother used to say, start as you mean to go on. So that once you are clear on the principles that guide you and what you stand for and what you will do in the name of the people of Barbados, it makes things a lot easier. Goal 5 is to ensure, sir, that what we do and what we create is fit for purpose, so that all legislation, regulations, policies, and procedures should be fit for the purpose that they're being created. They should reflect the specific needs of Barbados as a small island state in the 21st century. And so that is why one of the principles that we have identified in addressing this planning law reform has to do with e-government. Because one of the ways in which Barbados needs to step out into the 21st century is to move beyond using technology for things that entertain us and use it for things that advance our development. And so we are moving more and more to having online processes for much of what people need to do. So the principles of e-government and improved platforms for sharing data, for giving people management information, for giving people access to information, to giving people the ability to do their business is one of the principles. Good governance is one of our principles in considering this planning law reform. Consultation and participation by getting everyone engaged. A culture of proactively managing development and not just waiting for things to fall down around us as happened over the last decade. These are all principles that have guided our approach to this planning law reform. And so, sir, I want to move now to some of the recommendations that are being made. And I will begin with the question of what is our approach, what is the model that we use, what is the governance model that underpins the planning legislation. Now, in the Commonwealth Caribbean, there's the ministerial model, which is what obtains in Barbados now, which is where the responsibility for administering the legislation is with the minister, and that there is, however, considerable delegation to the chief town planner. So the minister then has the power to determine certain classes of application, has the power to decide appeals. Now, it may be argued, as it is argued in this document, that the way this system operates is not very transparent, because we do not know on what basis that individual might be making decisions. And things that are increasingly discretionary are increasingly lack accountability. There is a second possible model, which is a statutory corporation model, where a statutory corporation is vested with the powers to administer the act. And this kind of model has perhaps higher levels of accountability, but it also has higher costs associated with it. The recommendation, sir, that is being made in the document, and one of the matters that was perhaps discussed at length as the document was considered by the public, is that the model that we use in Barbados be a hybrid model, a hybrid of the two. And I want to explain what that is. The hybrid model would have, and this is for decision making on town planning matters, a statutory board. That board will be multidisciplinary. It would include representatives from regulatory authorities and the private sector, and it would be serviced by the Town and Country Planning Department office. So, as part of this model, appeals will be heard by a tribunal, and the minister would retain the power to determine certain classes of development. So this model perhaps is the balance of accountability and cost of the two previously described. So it seeks to have a more decentralized approach to decision making. And sir, I don't want to be naive or to appear naive in presenting perhaps another statutory body to make decisions. But I think that here is an opportunity, perhaps, to make sure that we apply the same principles of being fit for purpose and of being transparent and accountable, including financially so. I would say this is an opportunity to apply those same principles to how we constitute this statutory body, so that it is an opportunity to make sure that we have the relevant expertise, and that can be objectively decided. It can be decided that these are the types of skills, these are the types of perspectives that are necessary, and that this is the body that, based on these skills and experience, that we entrust with being able to administer the act, with the minister retaining some power to determine certain classes of development. And I want to make another thing clear. This is called a green paper because it is open for consultation, and because the consultants who are doing the work have been and continue to be accepting comments from all parties. And so the business in which we are engaged here today is to start to air, or to continue to air, I would say, because the document was online for some weeks until comments closed on the 5th of October. But it is an iterative process. And so we continue to get people's feedback on what is proposed herein. I will say that so far, based on the comments that have been received, that there is general support for most of the changes, and in particular, there is support for responsibility for routine decision making, support for what should be the role of the minister, and support for the hearing of appeals against decisions that have been made by Town and Country Planning. So we have already received a considerable number of comments, and we'll continue to incorporate those as appropriate going forward. So the document proposes this hybrid model, but which would of course mean that there would need to be clear regulations developed in order to govern how it operates. I move now quickly, sir, to the question of regulation of land development. And I will not seek to go through every single category and every single recommendation. The document is in the public domain, but I will try to point out or seek to point out the types of things that I think my fellow honourable members and the people of Barbados, through you, sir, would want to hear some discussion on. So, with respect to the regulation of land development, the purpose of the legislation is noted as to provide for the orderly and the progressive development of land. And so in that context, development is defined as carrying out of building, engineering, mining, or other operations, the making of material changes to the use of buildings or land, or the subdivision of land. And so within these categories, there are certain applications that are determined by the minister, and provisions that exist for having a hearing. And this is one of the elements of the system that has prone perhaps to the longest delays. And again, this level and the sense of public trust in the process has perhaps been undermined by the notion that there is a lack of transparency in this approach. Further, Barbados has entered into and continues to maintain a commitment to certain undertakings made at the international level. One of those is to undertake environmental impact assessments on proposed activities that are likely to have an adverse effect on the environment. Now, even though we have made that international commitment, there's still no comprehensive legal framework that covers this. And so the document proposes that an environmental impact assessment regulation be prepared to clarify when an EIA is required, to clarify how it should be conducted, and how any mitigation measures that are proposed therein would be monitored. With respect to the regulation of land development, the further recommendation is made to clarify the ways in which the Coastal Zone Management Act and the Town and Country Planning Act interact. So, sir, like most of these types of operations in government, there is a need to consult different actors. But within that, it is sometimes not clear where one actor's responsibility and role ends and another's begins. So there are quite a few changes proposed in the Green Paper with respect to the regulation of land development. One of these is that applications referred to the Minister for decision should only be those that represent significant departures from the physical development plan, or those that are of strategic, economic, or environmental importance. So that rather than allocating matters to the minister based on the nature of the development, based on whether it is a subdivision of land and so on, that in the context of an agreed and approved physical development plan, only those applications that depart from that plan, or those applications that are of strategic, economic, and environmental importance should be referred to the minister. It would mean then that a qualified inspector would hold a hearing and would report to the minister on those applications, and that rules for the conduct of hearings and site visits should be clarified, and any report or decision should be made publicly available. The paper further suggests that strict timetables be adhered to for responding to these kinds of applications. Now, sir, I have lost count of the number of times or the number of reports that have been made to me about people who have come to Barbados with the wherewithal, with the interest, with the excitement about investing here. People who are locals or residents of Barbados, who similarly have had a business idea and have been ready to go forward and have put applications in. And because of the tremendous delays, have left and taken their capital and their ideas and their interests and their jobs with them. Now, growth and investment are the things that are going to get us out of this crisis. What we are doing now, with the measures that have been announced, is stopping the bleeding. If we want to ensure that we do not get back here, this country has to grow in a real way. And we cannot afford to let inaction stop not just the country from growing, but stop Barbadians from being able to benefit, to participate in that growth. Because we use the word growth, but sometimes we don't understand what it looks like and what it means for people. What it means is that if I come here to invest in the renewable energy sector, and I want to invest in biofuel, and I'm using some kind of grass to generate the energy, it means that people are planting the grass, it means that people are maintaining it, it means that people are employed in the plant. If I am bringing a hotel, it means that there's not only construction opportunities, but it means that there are opportunities for people to operate long-term in the sector. If I am Ross University and I'm coming here to set up, it means that there are employment opportunities for people to provide services to the faculty and students of the university. If I am a medical facility that is looking to come to Barbados, it means that the opportunities for growth and employment are far-reaching. I always say that investors do not come here simply as investors. They are whole people. They may bring their families, they may bring their children, they will buy a house or they will rent a house. They will need to have the grass cut. They will need to have somebody to come and put on some paint. They may need to have all kinds of services provided. But beyond that, sir, one of the other things, commitments that we made as part of the manifesto is, yes, to be able to maintain opportunities for people in those sectors that I've just described, but also, and primarily, to be able to build a high-skilled knowledge economy. If there's one thing that Barbados has been able to demonstrate, it is its foundation in education. And I make the argument that perhaps our current education system needs, like so much more of what we're doing, to be further engineered to be fit for purpose and to be further engineered to be fit for this 21st century economy. But growth in this economy, sir, is not just about a number. It is about providing to people. It is about providing opportunity. It is about providing choice. And as I walk up and down the streets of St. Michael's South Central, one of the things that is clear to me is that ultimately what people want is opportunity. Is that people want to feel like they are participating in something rather than being on the sidelines while a handful of people benefit from any economic activity, as they had been under the last administration. The change that we as a Barbados Labour Party government have to make in people's lives is that we have to reverse the consolidation of wealth that we saw over the last decade and make sure that the growth that we see in Barbados is inclusive and is led by the majority of Barbadians. So when I talk about growth and when I talk about this reform being important for growth, it is not just because of Bert. It is not just because we have set targets. Targets are important, yes, and they must be adhered to. But we have those targets for a reason. And we have those targets because the kind of Barbados that we want to create depends on the levels of growth and investment that we are able to realize. Sir, that brings me to another aspect of the Act, and it is one that I think provides a real opportunity for us. It has to do with what we call planning obligations. So the concept of planning obligations was first introduced to Barbados through an amendment to the Town and Country Planning Act of 2007. And in that amendment, it was limited to the provision of affordable housing, so that it meant that if you were seeking permission for a particular structure or application or development, that one of the obligations, or the obligation that you had to make, had to do with providing affordable housing in the area of the development. But in other jurisdictions, the notion of planning obligations is used to fund and to support a range of physical requirements, of social requirements, and of environmental requirements. And so it means that we have the scope, sir, to require certain developers to ensure, for example, that green spaces are created in and around the area that they're developing for the community to have access to. It means that we have the scope for other kinds of social or physical or environmental gains to be made. And perhaps I prefer to think of it in terms of planning gains, because it means that apart from the hard economic benefits that this investment brings with it, other types of benefit, in particular to the community around it. I think one of the things that distinguishes Barbados as a country, as a jurisdiction, is that we have a physically integrated society. I've been to other places where you feel the divisions and the distinctions in how certain categories of people live. In Barbados, we have the benefit, I feel, of living in a country where everybody, as my grandmother would say, live alongside one another. But perhaps one of the dangers, one of the things that creates resentment is the notion that people other than me are coming into my community and are able to enjoy benefits that I cannot enjoy, or that as a result of the benefits that they are reaping, that I am now deprived of certain rights. And so this is notion of planning obligations and broadening the scope, introducing broader provisions for the planning obligations as the document recommends, is a tool for us to be able to better manage development in Barbados and better manage it so that we create spaces that speak to the whole person. We create spaces that reflect the Barbados in which we want to live. I think, sir, that another very regrettable outcome and really stain on our country and on our psyches of the last administration has simply to do with, I hesitate to say, the lack of development. On one hand, the lack of development of the country, of physical development, so that you really start to feel as if Barbados was frozen in time, or even a sense of arrested development, that nothing was happening, nothing was moving. But worse, we were not even able to maintain the status quo. Because the existing infrastructure, the existing roads and buildings, and the existing heritage sites, a lot of those buildings in Bridgetown, that as I walked through as a child, I would look around in wonder and think, what a beautiful place this is to live. And notwithstanding the dark history of our country, because I think it's something that more and more we will have to confront. But the fact is that I used to feel proud, certainly I think most Barbadians felt proud, to walk around and look around and see what is it, where is it that we live, and have a certain pride in the way that we comport ourselves and keep our surroundings. And you know, I, sir, grew up in a village, and everyone had their little plot of land. And most people had their little garden. My mother had a kitchen garden in the back, and she had a flower garden in the front. And every house, as you walk down Sinclair Road and Haggett Hall, as you walk down Bird Hill, as you go up Monroe Road and Pastor Road, similarly in Carrington Village, as you go through Arthur's Gap, as you go through Tweedside Road, every lot, as you go through Delamere Land, every little lot was kept in pristine condition. I always used to say that if it's one thing poor people knew how to be, it was neat and tidy. Well, we didn't have a choice, really, because you were judged if you weren't. But this sense of Barbadian pride, sir, that was reflected in how we kept our surroundings, and that was reflected in how the state also kept public spaces. That too, on top of everything else, has been completely abandoned in the lack of attention that has been given to public spaces and public infrastructure in this country. And so we have an opportunity here, sir, to start to restore the sense of Barbadian pride in how we live, in where we live, in what is around us, through some attention to planning obligations. So I want to go quickly to changes that are being suggested in the document with respect to limitation periods. And this one I think is important because I think that we have to be accountable. We do have to be accountable. You know, sometimes I read documents that make reference to free healthcare in Barbados, free education and free healthcare. And I think, but it is not free. The things that we enjoy, that a government invests in, we have to take a decision to invest in it, but it is not free. And the burden that sits on the shoulders of myself and my honourable colleagues in this chamber is one of responsibility to Barbadians. Barbadians who have an expectation, not that things will be fixed overnight, but have an expectation that the people that they have elected will have a sense of accountability to them. And so I think that that accountability is important. And I think that being able to place some specificity on that accountability is the only way we are going to show what we are made of. I'm not afraid of accountability. And so the proposed changes with respect to limitation periods suggest a tiered system of time scales should be introduced. And those time scales are 8 weeks for simple applications and 13 weeks for more complex applications, and 16 weeks for applications that would require an environmental impact assessment. The document further suggests that strict timelines be adhered to from the date of receipt of the required information from the applicant. You know, I confess that I am not a planning expert, but to the extent that these decisions are crucial for investment, they are within the domain of the ministry in which I sit. And it means that from time to time I hear anecdotes about what people experience. And one of the recurring stories has had to do with the level of predictability of information required. So you asked me to submit these 2 pieces of paper, and I submit them, and you review them, and while I am waiting, expecting that within a certain amount of time, within 8 weeks, I will have a response. Within 8 weeks, I hear, oh, well, you know, you were supposed to send this. And it's not just in this domain that it happens. Again, that is a frustration. It is a frustration that costs people their sense of trust in the process, and is a frustration that quite simply costs people money. And so we have to have a sense of predictability on what people are expected to submit, what information is required from the applicant, and how the applicant is expected to fulfill whatever are the expectations of the Town and Country Planning Office. With respect to limitation periods, the document further suggests that consultations with referral agencies should be in accordance with existing strict timelines. So it means that if I have to go to Coastal to get their decision or to get their advice, that would be within whatever is the set timeline, so that I do not go to the applicant, or when the applicant calls, that I don't say, well, it is with Coastal, or it is with the Honourable Member for St. Peter, or it is with the Honourable Member for St. James South, because applicants feel a sense of powerlessness. You cannot operate. If we agree that economic development is about the provision of choice and agency, where agency has to do with feeling a sense of power and empowerment, to control your own destiny, where you can't feel as if your destiny is forever in the hands of other people. And I speak frankly to the matter because these are the issues that confront us. And so beyond the setting of time schedules, that there should be recourse to appeal to the board if the timelines are not met. And I stand in full support, in particular, of this part of the recommendations, because I think it is important to have concrete ways in which you are holding people accountable. We may differ and we may vary and we may discuss what those timelines are, but the fact that you have to be held accountable with benchmarks for how and what you deliver is one that I fully support. And I support it beyond this to other areas of government and private sector business. Now, quite briefly, I want to move to two further matters outlined in the recommendations. One has to do with the enforcement, and the final area of the green paper on which I will focus has to do with the implementation. With respect to enforcement, the Chief Town Planner right now, under the Act, under the current Act, has considerable discretion to take action against anyone who's in breach of the planning legislation. So, in many ways, this process too lacks transparency, because the more discretionary a process is, the lower the level of transparency and accountability, because one cannot be sure on what basis a decision has been made. And so the Green Paper proposes the following. It proposes that the grounds on which an enforcement notice can be appealed to a judge in chambers should not be limited as it currently is under the Act. It further recommends, and the proposed changes to which I made reference, sir, are not exhaustive, but I am highlighting the ones that I believe the House might want to air for further discussion, and that through you, the people of Barbados will want to have brought to their attention. It further suggests that enforcement and stop notices should be prepared and served by persons with adequate training in legal requirements and procedures, so that they understand the law, so that they understand the context, so that they understand their rights and their responsibilities in serving enforcement and stop notices. It recommends further that the Chief Town Planner should keep a publicly accessible register of enforcement action, which should be available online. Now, I am one who believes in the transparency of information. Not just because it's good governance, but because it is actually good economics. It is good sense, because the truth is that if you can demonstrate that you are acting fairly, then there can be no sense that you are not. It is quite simply the sensible thing to do. And the truth is, if you are acting fairly, well, you should have nothing to hide. And so, the recommendation to have a publicly accessible register of enforcement action, I think, is a sound one, because I think in particular that you want to have a sense that justice has been done. People want to be able to see that even where a decision is made against them, that they know and they understand, and that one set of rules were not applied to the member for St. Michael West, and another set of rules applied to the member for Christchurch East Central. Because really, one of the things I believe that has frustrated Barbadians over the last 10 years, and that we have seen emerge, is the idea and the fact of two Barbadoses. That one set of rules applies to people who operate in a certain space, or have certain friends, or have certain influence and power, and another set of rules applies to people with less influence and with less economic and social power. And so, in the interest of the equal application and equal treatment of all under the law, and to be able to show by comparison that a decision taken in May 2018 in Wotton and a decision taken under similar circumstances in a similar context in Carrington Village in June can be shown to be the same. It is important to be able to show that. So finally, when it comes to implementation, I come to this part because I think it is important to highlight that these kinds of processes do not happen in a vacuum, and these kinds of processes require further investment of time and resources. So that the journey that we are on is one of legislative change. And once we agree to new legislation, once we have gone through the conversation, when the new legislation is in place, there will need to be detailed policy notes and orders and regulations, and a need to establish the new governance arrangements, because I don't want us to fool ourselves that the existence of legislation equates to its enforcement or to its good practice. We need to make sure that the actors, the people who will need to provide service and to administer the new act, not only understand what they're doing, but also feel empowered to act. And just like with much of what we're doing, it requires a strong desire for change. It requires the creation of a culture for change, and it requires, quite practically, a set of timelines. It requires a plan for how we will get there and what we are measuring ourselves against. So we have to set targets. We have to understand that we are implementing change not just in the legislation, but also in the process that guides us. So, sir, the paper before us and my presentation this morning has not been exhaustive. I want to encourage Barbadians, and through you, I encourage Barbadians to interact with the decisions that your government is making. Because the only way that we are going to cultivate real democracy is if Barbadians participate in the ongoing processes of change. I think one of the goods that we have to be able to deliver for people is the sense that they have the space to participate. So my presentation this morning, sir, has not been exhaustive. It has not covered all of the aspects of the suggested changes for law reform, but for planning law reform. But what I sought to do was to draw out some of what I think are the very important aspects of what we're trying to do, in particular, the spirit of what we are attempting to do. The fact that we have an imperative, we have a mandate to change the investment climate in this country. We have a mandate to signal, as we have been doing, I believe, to the region, to the international community, that Barbados is ready to get back on the path to what we were becoming. I think that we have in this legislation an opportunity to put our money where our mouth is, to be able to say to Barbadians, you can trust us to deliver. I believe that it is time, and it is timely, and it is important to turn the conversation to the growth that is required, but not just to the growth that is required, but to the opportunities that exist for Barbadians to participate in that growth. And that in so doing, that they will know that the government that they elected on May 24th is supporting their goals and ambitions according to all of the powers that government has. That we do not just consider our role, our responsibility, and our place to be tax and spend, to implement revenue measures and to make spending decisions, but it is to create the environment in which activity can take place. You know, I say all the time that government does not grow, the private sector grows. And the private sector, and when I say private sector, I mean writ large. I don't just mean big business. The private sector has to lead the way for growth and development in this country. But in doing so, we have to make sure that all Barbadians are at the table and are eating. So when we talk about private sector in Barbados, I am also talking about the man who wants to get a vendor's license and who has not been able to do so for 4 years for no good reason. I am talking about the young man in Flagstaff who fixes bicycles and who wants to be able and has the wherewithal, who wants to be able to set up a shop on the side of his house, but wants to know that once he does so within the law, he will get a timely decision so that he can support his family. And so as I close, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to Barbadians that this Barbados Labour Party government, yes, is about making sure that we accomplish recovery of our economy, because we have to. There is no basis to go forward without it. But beyond that, this Barbados Labour Party government is concerned and has put and will continue to put all of its energy into the real engines of growth in this country. The education of its people, the well-being of its people, and creating the kind of environment that people can trust and people know that once they have engaged the government of Barbados to offer assistance or to provide a service, that we take seriously that commitment and that obligation, and that we will deliver to them. And with those few words, sir, I thank you. I move, sir, that the resolution.
Honourable Mr. Michael West.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think, Mr. Speaker, this matter brought by the Honourable Member for St. Michael's South Central and so ably presented is a very important one. And it comes at a very critical time in our development as we look to cast a vision as to the potential path Barbados can take in pursuit of prosperity for the majority of our people as we go forward. But you look around this Honourable House today, you would not have thought that the critical importance of this matter is to be appreciated by all, because we're discussing a green paper on planning as policy, planning policy. We look around this chamber, there is absolutely no senior minister here in this chamber to represent the interests of government and to help us to debate these matters. There's no minister here who deals with housing or lands or construction. There is no minister here who deals with agriculture or water or transportation or roads, public works. There's no minister here who deals with energy. And I really think that it is somewhat unbecoming to have an honourable member so young in this enterprise, representing the interests not only of our constituency but of the national community on this critical matter at this urgent time. And there be no presence in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, of one single senior minister on behalf of the government. I think that that is sad. But the debate must, and I'm sorry to have to say that, I really am. You may not think so, but I really am. But the debate must go on, Mr. Speaker. We cannot transform this nation either as an economy or as a society without dealing with the matter of physical development planning in a very serious way. If we transform this society, I anticipate and envisage new modes of transportation, new models of housing and housing development. I anticipate even more significant levels of impact due to the presence and the development of further technologies. The dynamic of aging is also very important in the context of our Barbados. So if we are going to actually capture those critical aspects of growth and development and really transform this nation, this society, this economy, and we have to treat the planning. And I see this green paper before us today and the consultations which have preceded this as an indication that it is clearly understood that we have to better plan and more radically plan if we are not only going to see growth and development, but transformation in our Barbadian experience. This green paper gives, in brief, a philosophical perspective on what development is about. And if I may quote from the document itself, I think it's on page 31, Mr. Speaker, says it's about the purpose of planning legislation is to provide for the orderly and progressive development of the land. The purpose of planning legislation is to provide for the orderly and progressive development of the land. And I think that that is a little narrow, and therefore could be more expansively expressed. I think development must also take on board the ethical dynamics of our actions, the ethical dynamics associated with our legislative framework going forward. Development must be about the economic enterprise in which the country will engage as we seek to cause our citizens to come into greater levels of prosperity, and that the prosperity that we experience would be universally shared. But that planning must also take on board human development concerns, social development concerns, cultural development concerns. And I'm simply saying that the way the philosophical thrust or vision is expressed is narrow. Perhaps it is just the paucity of expression rather than the large richness of the vision. But development for me is more than simply an economic orientation, but it has to take on board ethical considerations, sociocultural and human development issues. I think these things must be captured in whatever frameworks we develop on the laws that we seek to put in place. Certainly the development must be balanced. I don't think Barbados can boast of having achieved balanced development. There are certain issues which are very much a part of the folklore in Barbados. There are certain developments which we have seen arise and be established, and we have had our questions on the sideline and from the distance, Mr. Speaker, as you would very well know. I'm simply trying to suggest that whatever we do going forward in terms of that vision casting for physical development planning and then the actualization of it, I'm simply trying to suggest that the concept of the balanced development must be achieved. I don't think our efforts towards that have been sufficiently successful in the past. Certainly a goal of planning for the development, physical development of a country must also aim that whatever the evidence of that development going forward, whether it has to do with specific investments, whether it has to do with social housing, whatever the evidence that presents itself after our efforts have been substantially put in place, I am seeking to say that part of the goal must be poverty reduction. And it cannot simply be development for infrastructural or aesthetic value, development simply to attract investment, the byproducts of which then redound to the benefit of a narrow few or are consolidated within a certain group, but that there be poverty reduction and that the majority classes in the country who are beset by the dynamics of poverty find that there's a way forward, a way up for them, a better way of life for our people is what we seek. Mr. Speaker, I think things like shoreline or coastal development should not be politicized. We cannot, I think, honestly boast in Barbados that this has not been the case. There's a sufficient evidence, and some of it very recent, that coastline development, shoreline development has become the subject of the political intrigue that goes on in Barbados from time to time. And I don't think, there are many things I should say that would frustrate our efforts to see development, physical development of Barbados redounding in economic benefits for the majority of our people. Many things would frustrate that. One of the biggest frustrating factors, I think, is when the political element comes to the fore at the expense of every other consideration And that happens from time to time. In the public arena, it is still very much felt by many people that a recent experience revolving around the efforts of having to do with the Hayat, for instance, this has become the subject of political intrigue, political interference, political bias. And you are a man of the street, Mr. Speaker, and I say that not in any way to detract from your honored position or your honored profession, but I know you to be very much a man of the street. You are in touch with the people. You walk on earth, and you would understand what I say when I tell you that it is very much in the bosom of the people out there that political interference sometimes gets in the way of these development projects, these physical development projects, these investment projects, and the country becomes the loser. And when it comes to shoreline and coastal development, that is especially the case. We are a tourism destination. Tourism is our number one and front burner industry, so to speak. And it's a service and a product that we export to the world, so to speak. And much of the goings on relative to the development of our tourism product has to do with coastline and shoreline development and investment. And here is where politics comes to the table sometimes, frustrating processes, distorting the issues, and causing the country and its people ultimately to be the losers. There's the ugly story not too far behind us of the Four Seasons project. Not only are we faced with an environmental unsightly specter of what remains there, the relics of investment interests. The story is ugly. People's reputations have been sullied. Questions remain unanswered, and rumors abound. And that was considered by many to be potentially a major investment project that could have benefited the country substantially. But it's been mired not only in financial and other issues, it's been mired in political intrigue as well. Simply saying, for a small country like ours, if we're serious about planning with a strong sense of vision going forward, matters like that, we've got to leave the politics at home. Be mature enough and be big enough to understand what is in the national interest, what benefits can accrue to our efforts at development, and how are investors best to be treated in a non-political, non-partisan way at the end of the day, so that the country benefits. I think on page 51 in the same document, Mr. Speaker, addresses the issue of planning obligations. And this is important. Investors come to seek advantage. Planners of development want to seek their own advantage, often economic advantage. Countries like ours that depend upon investment, particularly external investment, foreign investment, are faced with demands from time to time that we accede to wishes that would make it easier for those who desire to invest to actually do so. And so we grant concessions. And that's our history, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a give and take situation. We don't give up the interests of the country, but we give in the interests of the country. We yield and we accede to certain proposals or demands, and that is fair, that is fitting, that is nothing new. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I wonder sometimes if a sufficient emphasis is put on bringing investors to the point where they understand, look, This country needs your development. Yes, we will approve this project. Yes, because it serves the country's interests and you get a return on your investment. But here's something which you can do to help this country on a pace. And if you do that and help this country on a pace, it redounds to the benefit of your endeavors and enterprise at the end of the day. Simply to illustrate, Mr. Speaker, when the Sandals people were giving all of those concessions by the last administration, I wonder, we don't know a lot about the agreement, the arrangements. At least I certainly don't, and that's part of the problem. That's another issue that has to do with development, it has to do with transparency to get to that. But I wonder what leverage was used by a government that was being asked for that level of concessions. What leverage would have been used by a government to ensure that a corporation, an entity like that, committed itself to some planning obligations that could help this country just a little bit, maybe with a small housing development issue, a road infrastructural thing, urban upgrade stuff. You know where I'm coming from, Mr. Speaker. These guys come and they get a lot. The question is, at the end of the day, are they in any way being strenuously encouraged to give a little by way of helping with our social, with our infrastructural and other development, so that these things could be attached to planning approvals? And I think the document is suggesting that this is the path ahead, and it is a path which should be more widely and openly embraced. And I support that wholeheartedly. It's affirmative action with an investor dynamic involved. Affirmative action is not only something that is undertaken by states that want to help marginalized groups or minority groups. It's an action in which investors can be involved and show their goodwill as corporate, international corporate citizens to help to develop the jurisdiction in which they are investing and out of which they will reap handsomely, as is the case, I understand, with the Sandals Corporation, if that's the right designation. We got to bear in mind, Mr. Speaker, we talk about these types of investment, whether they are on the coastline or the shoreline, or whether they are more in the interior, or towards the interior. And I think was alluded to, a small space state like Barbados, there isn't much that you could refer to as being interior. We're all pretty much on the coastline, or could be impacted by dynamics operating around the shoreline or coastline. I do very well remember, Mr. Speaker, when I served in the cabinet as a member of the government of the day and had some responsibility for disaster management. I was taken aback when I was told that storm surge of a certain level coming on the western or southwestern coast of Barbados could push water up into your constituency, Mr. Speaker. So we're not all very far from the shoreline, and that's push seawater up into your constituency, the Bank Hall area. That's what I was told, and that take out a lot of people. And take out a lot of infrastructure. The point I am really seeking to make is that whatever the nature of the investment, whether it is a highly competitive context of the coastal area or the shoreline, or whether it is more of an interior or internal development, we have got to be very careful. It's something which I call the clash of cultures. And by that I mean clash of cultures. There's a big developer. Usually this is an external or foreign investor, and he's interested in a certain project, maybe on the coastline. But this is major investment. This is major investment. This is major capital being expended here or invested here. And sometimes that type of development causes a situation where there's a guy on the other end of the spectrum who operates a small craft for recreational activity very close to the shore. And there's a clash, there's a conflict of interest seemingly. I call it a clash of cultures. It's foreign as opposed to local, it's big as opposed to small. These are issues that we really have to deal with. And therefore, we have to make sure that whatever plans we put in place are so conceptualized that the potential negative dynamics are taken out of the mix. Politics, as I have been saying, being one of them. We can lose our investment appeal if we allow these negatives to reflect themselves in any significant fashion. I want to move on from that. I think I've said enough about that, Mr. Speaker. Now, you, Mr. Speaker, and I am sure you know quite well, represent a constituency which is quite close to Bellevue. I think, in fact, Bellevue is part of your constituency. And there are certain parts of that geography that relate to St. Michael East as well. So you are very much face-to-face with the issue of squatting. And I know sometimes, and I say this without apology, sometimes we bring an elitist attitude to this phenomenon of squatting. And we want to dismiss people who squat out of hand. And I am not in any way supporting the embrace of law-breaking efforts or practices by anybody. You shouldn't break the law, so I don't want to be accused of encouraging people to break the law and squat where they shouldn't and do this. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that the phenomenon of squatting with which you are familiar, I grew up in Station Hill, just across the pasture. You know the pasture, which used to be a pasture. That's another issue, Mr. Speaker. You got to do something about that, Your Honor. It used to be a pasture, almost totally destroyed by the passage of vehicles, by some elements of squatting, and other misuse of the place. That was my backyard. You have to do something about that, Mr. Speaker. And all I'm saying here is the instinct to squatting is born of a certain need and a certain demand. It is need for housing, it's a need for shelter, it's a need for access to land. And I don't just think it's an instinct to lawlessness. And like I said, I'm not encouraging anybody to go squat. I'm simply saying that we cannot, from year to year, from year after year, year after year, look at what is happening up in the Bellevue area and other parts of Barbados, where there's some level of degradation existing among those who must occupy those circumstances. And we can't just look at it year after year after year and do nothing about it. Squatting is born of a certain need. Squatting is born of a certain demand. Squatting is born of a certain class dynamic in Barbados. The essence of what I'm trying to say, Mr. Speaker, is that physical development planning has to take on board class dynamics. Class dynamics. And it cannot take on board class dynamics in a one-sided way, where we provide comfortably for those who have the wherewithal, for those who sometimes can buy their way around, and we neglect the interests of those at the other end of the scale who have no access to land, who have little capacity to afford housing, and by circumstances then become driven to do the thing we would prefer them not to do. We end up with the Bellevues, Gemswick of this world. And that is a very serious thing. So We cannot dismiss the class dynamic as we conceptualize these policies. The issue of the restrictions on land use because of the presence of what we call water zones has been a real bugbear in Barbados. Certainly by now, engineering skills have reached a stage, and our capacity as a people perhaps has been arrived at to such an extent that we can start to incorporate into our planning the engineering responses to the issue of restrictions on land access caused by water zone areas in a context where we're small size. We are a lot of people, one of the most densely populated places in the world, certainly in the region. And we've got to use the limited space available to us. And whereas we have to protect our water resources from contamination of all sorts, and including those caused by human agency, we must bring to bear the engineering responses that can be brought to bear to address land scarcity in that particular regard. Now, Mr. Speaker, transparency-related issues are important. The Honourable Member, St. Michael South Central, dealt with that as well. The Green Paper addresses that, understandably so. Part of the problem we've had historically in Barbados when it comes to country issues and physical development matters has been questions related to transparency of the processes and of the decisions and revolving around the decisions which have been made. I believe, as I see seemingly intimated here in the document, the Green Paper, that the potential for corruption is understood to be associated with the adoption of the ministerial model. You want to take, potentially, public figures out of harm's way. You want to reduce temptation, want to eliminate it if possible, and we want to make sure that a level of integrity obtains among those who lead us, and that is pretty high on the agenda of the nation these days. And therefore, anything which potentially offers easy opportunity for corrupt practices, either by public officials or those seeking the favor of public officials, we need to treat to. And I think the efforts outlined in this document address that matter. In Barbados, there has always been, there's long been, a low confidence threshold relative to the matter of planning approvals. And I don't have evidence which you might have, Mr. Speaker, that misdeeds are perpetrated by any public official, but I know that Bajans feel that they don't have, that you cannot place fully your confidence in these processes. And that, I don't think, is news. That is not the news of the day. That has been the case. I think if we read, and I tried last night to read this document carefully, it is suggesting that the potential to corruption must be addressed as we frame laws for physical development planning, especially as it relates to those who have to review applications, the process involved in arriving at decisions, and the interaction between the public and the public officials. And whatever the folklore suggests, whatever the rumor mill shows up, and whatever the evidence confirms, we have to go forward with this in view, that if we're going to do this properly, we have to build in the mechanisms to counter potential corruption in the process. I agree with the expressed intention, perhaps the consideration, to have a sustainable development board. As I understand it, you want to take partisan individuality and, to some extent, ministerial purview and discretion out of the matter and immerse it in a framework which more substantially would evoke the confidence of the public in the processes which are ongoing around planning and planning approvals. Sustainable Development Board, because it's intended to some extent to be non-political, to be transparent, to be an anti-corruption mechanism, and to allow us to achieve greater efficiencies in management and in the delivery of services. And I don't think anybody would want to argue against that. There's also the consideration of having an appeals tribunal to review the decisions of the Town and Country Planning Department, as opposed to leaving that responsibility solely in the hands and the powers of a minister. And who would want to argue with that? Mr. Speaker, you sit in the chair comfortably, so you're not faced with that type of temptation. But your colleagues do not want to be faced with that type of temptation. And we do not want to set up, as we go forward, a situation where purveyors of criminal evil would want to corrupt your erstwhile colleagues. And I support you in that sentiment wholeheartedly. And of course, access to information. If you're going to be transparent, people have to be more involved in the process. Use the technology of the day to allow for better access. Allow for citizen participation in some of the processes of planning. And bring professional people who are not necessarily connected with the state agency immediately and directly into the process, and let them bring their expertise to assist in helping us to frame and fashion the frameworks, but also to actually give actualization to the processes. So transparency and very important, and I support the major stipulations or provisions in considerations in the Green Paper that will help us to get there. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak a little bit about what I call legacy-related issues. I'm going to refer to this document with your leave, Mr. Speaker. With your leave, Mr. Speaker. This is the report of the National Commission on Law and Order, Draft Plan and Justice, Peace, Security, June 2004. And I think this is already a document of this House. I want to make the point that planning must consider cultural values. Planning laws and planning regulations must consider cultural values. Cannot be divorced from our cultural mores and our cultural values and our cultural context. And I think the honorable member, Sir Michael South Central, alluded to that briefly. But that matter was addressed in this report of the Law and Order Commission in 2004, a document of which I'm sure you are fully seized, being a practitioner in the courts of Barbados, and one highly acclaimed with respect to the practice of law, and well saluted. On page 67, I just quote a few lines. talking about the increase in new housing developments, that's the section. Many of these developments resulted in districts where houses have been built as dormitories, but in which communities have neither grown nor developed. He's talking about the absence of community in Barbados today. The spirit and social responsibility which generally typified the village are all but non-existent in these districts. To support the concept of islands within an island is to provide legitimacy for the notions of us and them, so frequently repeated by young voices today. Building communities which are so exclusive that they are entirely separated by physical structures has the dangerous potential of alienating some segments of the population. So that is the issue of alienation, Mr. Speaker. And I really want to suggest that if we haven't done it, that Barbados needs, as it considers new policies for physical development planning, to study the impact of closed communities. Some people call them gated communities. I want to say closed communities, because at the end of the day, a gate is just a gate. It's more closed communities in the context of a small state or small space. That Law and Order Commission, Mr. Speaker, recommended that government reassess the role and responsibility of the Town and Country Planning Department, recognizing the impact of physical development on social matters. Government, before granting approval, should carefully consider the desirability of establishing gated communities and conduct thorough studies on their impact in other Caribbean countries. Developers of all new residential estates should be mandated to provide and maintain adequate common social and recreational facilities to be shared by residents. Government should seek to ensure that adequate physical development plans are drafted and implemented to improve the living and social conditions in the areas sometimes described as ghettos or slums. And the point being made, Mr. Speaker, and I hope fairly clearly, is that we need to study formally the impact of closed communities in the context of a small state, and that planning pressure should be put on those who develop housing to ensure that the socio-cultural dynamics of Barbadian life are taken into consideration. After all, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we live in Barbados, in the Caribbean region, and in not some impersonal developed country context. We want to know each other while at the same time accommodating each other's privacy, and the right balance must be found. I know that the government is considering or has plans, and I hope that the economic situation now confronting us does not too far push back those plans. But I'm referring to the government's desire. Sound like I'm speaking for the government. I'm referring to the government's desire to redress or address the matter of intergenerational overcrowding in some of the traditional, the early housing development schemes in Barbados. And I remember hearing reference to a program for the Pine, because you got 2 and 3 generations living in small housing units built in the 50s and 60s, which do not at all properly accommodate the life habits of 2018 going forward. But generations in an overcrowded, small housing space context with all that that portends. And I believe that in going forward planning, need to look at that if government is in a position to so do by itself or in partnership somehow, partnership arrangements with the private sector to develop the more modern government housing settlements that we see. That is fine, but even as we do that, we still have to remember that there's a Pine, there's a Grisettes, there's a Bailan, and these housing situations still exist from 50s and 60s, and 2 and 3 generations occupy small spaces where our habits of life have changed largely in the last 4, 5, 6 decades. I believe, Mr. Speaker, the document also addresses at page 46 the matter of, that is the document, the green paper, the matter of protection, heritage protection legislation. This is another thing of great importance, of extremely great importance. On page 45, if I may quote from this document, Barbados has a wealth of heritage assets, which provides a very valuable heritage tourism product. However, much of the built heritage is in poor condition and at risk of loss. The existing legislation is weak and very limited, and penalties for non-compliance are so low that they provide no deterrent whatsoever. The designation of UNESCO World Heritage status for Bridgetown and its historic garrison recognizes the importance of this key asset, but does not provide the protection or tools to maximize its potential. So the protection of heritage assets, that which is built, that which is more organic, if I might express it like that, Mr. Speaker, is very important, and I am sure the policy paper gives clear indication that this is also to be addressed. On that matter of UNESCO, the UNESCO designation of Bridgetown as a World Heritage site, Mr. Speaker, I know you walk on earth, as I said. So you walk the streets not only of Bridgetown, Broad Street, Swan Street, but you go through the alleys. I know you very well, Mr. Speaker, and this does not take away from your honored position. I go through the alleys too. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it is worse now than it has ever been in the past. No, it is obnoxious. It is abhorrent. The smell, you guys need to walk the alleys of Bridgetown. I know you do, Honourable Member from St. Thomas. I am speaking to people like the Honourable Member St. John and St. George South. They're looking at me as though they did not know that there were alleys in Bridgetown. That is out of Bridgetown. I'm talking about in Bridgetown. You need to walk the alleys of Bridgetown, and the absence of toilet facilities, I suppose, prompts people, especially people who have some ailment, especially people who are beset a bit by problems associated with age. And it is worse now, Mr. Speaker, than it was before. All I'm saying simply is that that is an issue. How can you claim you're a World Heritage Site? Not much has been done by the last administration to take advantage of that designation, and I have every confidence. I have every confidence in the Honourable Member of St. Philip West and the Minister of Culture, and whichever other minister will hold his hand to help him with these matters, that these matters will be addressed. UNESCO designation is a very important thing. We should be using that somehow to ensure that there is a a greater level of tourist appeal based on that or related to that. But quite apart from that, coming home, I'm down in the alleys, Mr. Speaker, as you are from time to time, and it is rank down there. It is bad. And I do not understand how in 2018 you still have a situation where you have to go into some places, business places in Broad Street, that are making a lot of money, that post large and high numbers with respect to profits, that are bringing new charges and putting them upon us every day, and yet they would not provide a bathroom for facility for their customers and clients. In 2018, I am to ask what pressure is being put. Hey, it cannot be beyond a bank in Broad Street or wherever else. Irrespective of how the building is now logistically profiled, to build on a bathroom to which the public can have access. Sorry? It's covered in the health and safety at work. And we're not enforcing that, you're saying.
No crosstalk, please. Address the chamber, please.
Yeah, but I don't know what laws exist, Mr. Speaker, but whatever they are, if they do exist, they have to be enforced. I have seen with my own eyes an elderly person suffer stress and embarrassment because of that. I don't want to bring it down to that small and individual unit level, but Bridgetown is a World Heritage Site. And the celebrated Calypso said what, Mr. Speaker? No toilets in town. No toilet. I don't know who sang it. Mr. Honourable Member said Philip West will be able to tell me better who sang it, but I know it's in Trinidad. All over town, no toilets. So, Mr. Speaker, the broader point is legislation to better protect our heritage sites, the built and organic, so to speak, heritage. There's a concept. There's something called empty property legislation. And we have this issue in Barbados, all over Barbados. And some attempts have been made to deal with the problem, but the problem persists. It's not going away. It's not diminished by any significant extent. Vacant properties, unused properties, some of them ownership in dispute, some of it ownership non-existent, but they're there. They're there. And we have people struggling for land. We have people struggling for access to housing. And all these vacant properties exist. They're posing all kinds of threats, health threats, social behavioral threats. They're posing, presenting opportunities for crime and other misdeeds. And it must be in the capacity of government to negotiate ownership, for ownership of some of these vacant properties, so that we may treat to the dynamics relative to the aesthetics, the environment. It must be that we can bring enforcement to bear to a greater extent than we now do. In circumstances like this, where these properties exist in growing numbers at a time when people are struggling and government is challenged to find the capacity to help to transfer land and to give people access, people at the bottom, access to housing. Some instances, higher taxes are used and applied to these vacant lots So that you have a vacant lot and it's not being used, you pay a higher level of taxation. It's a penalty. It's an incentive, if you want to call it that, to put that property into positive use and to help us to deal with the negatives associated with that. Mr. Speaker, I realize that so many others do, I'm sure you do too, that this problem is now a problem more immediately attaching itself to government, because more and more we are seeing properties formerly used by government for public service delivery being abandoned. They're barricaded, they're abandoned, they stay there for years, some of them large, as this one not too far from us over here, the old National Insurance building. Some of them smaller, the training division building in the Pine there. The Louis Lynch School has been sitting there for years. These are abandoned properties. Whatever the cause of the abandonment, they sit there. They are empty properties. And I believe that some serious study and effort must be made and done to see if some proper use, effective use can be made of these properties. They're community groups. I had a man one time he said to me more than once, you see that building there in the Pine, you know what I could do with that? And he's talking about community-related programs. He ain't talking about making any money. There's no business enterprise, just to serve the community. You know what I could do with that? But it sits there, and it will sit there, and it will decay, and it will rot. We need to come to a national consensus as to what we want to do, Mr. Speaker, with respect to these high buildings. The Hyatt was a case that presented itself. The issue, we understand, had more so to do with environmental impact assessment, but there were questions about the proposed height of the building in the coastal area and in the city area. And I do not know that if we've arrived at a common understanding as to what we want to do with development that takes us up. As a layman, I would suggest that since we are short of land space and overpopulated, we need to make more use of the space going up. Rather, that's also a spatial dimension, rather than simply concentrate on going out. Up is a spatial dimension. But we have to have a consensus as to with what do we want to go up? Where do we want to go up? And how high do we want to go? I do not know if we fully ventilated that issue as a country. Mr. Speaker, I note the time, and I will be here for a little while. And would you want a break for lunch?
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move suspension of this morning's sitting until 2:30 this afternoon.
Second that, sir.
Question is that this chamber we now suspended until 2:30 in the afternoon. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. This honorable chamber is now suspended until 2:30 p.m.